The Great Wall, started in 700 BC, stood all through the history of Chinese feudal society. It is the longest defense work in world history. Like a mighty dragon, it winds up and down the mountains and crosses the rivers of northern China. Its total length, which has changed throughout its history, is more than 5,000 kilometers. Today, it is a symbol of Chinese hospitality for tourists from around the world. But the tourists are probably unaware that the bricks under their feet are actually very young. The ancient part of the wall looks completely different. Sunrise to sundown, farm life has continued on this ancient land for at least some 3,000 years. In the 9th century BC, a new regime began ruling this agriculture-based county, the Western Zhou. The Western Zhou was established along the Yellow River, and its territory was surrounded by the Diyi, Qiang, and Rong minor ethnic groups. The Western Zhou army began building mounds of earth to defend against outside forces. These mounds served as beacon towers. They were built with rammed earth and looked just like mounds of dirt, but in fact, they formed a sophisticated two-component alarm system. The two components looked similar on the outside, but they had different functions. One sent out a smoke signal during the day, and the other a fire signal at night. According to an excavated Han Dynasty book, there was a daylight beacon every 20 to 25 kilometers, and a nighttime beacon about every 5 kilometers. The signal could be transmitted through the system over 1,000 kilometers a day to call for reinforcements. The last emperor of the Western Zhou liked to set off the alarm system just to amuse his favorite concubine, bringing in troops from all directions for a false alarm. His concubine was amused, but his dynasty soon collapsed. In 771 BC, the Western Zhou dynasty fell. The story of the emperor who cried wolf and the sophisticated alarm system became history. The beacon system was the earliest form of the Great Wall. After the Western Zhou fell, China split up into separate states. This time is known as the Spring and Autumn and Warring States period. Each state ruled by a prince needed clear borders and a means of protection, so each one built tall walls to mark and defend its territory. Many nomads, without fixed territories, lived around the waters and grasslands in China's north. They had no agricultural land of their own. During the dry season, they stormed into the central plain on their horses to seize grain. They were highly mobile, making them formidable enemies. They were a constant thorn in the side of farmers and even the army soldiers living along the border. To protect themselves, the separate states began to build walls to connect their beacon towers. This was the earliest Great Wall. Ever since that time, this magnificent defense work has been built up only to be destroyed and then built up again many times. Nobody knows how many ruins of the wall are still waiting to be discovered in the mountains. This group of people is making a field survey in search of sections of the Great Wall. Start from April 6, 2006. The team began trudging through the wilderness, looking for undiscovered ruins of the Great Wall, using only simple tools. The Great Wall is very old. It was begun in the 5th century BC, during the Warring States period, and has stood through the ups and downs of many dynasties. Qin Shi Huang unified China in 221 BC and established the Qin Dynasty, the first centralized regime in China's history. He called himself the first emperor, implying there would be many to follow. He realized that the biggest threat to his power was the nomads roaming the grasslands in the north. In 214 BC, he ordered most of the walls built by the separate states demolished. He then had the walls of Yan, Jiao, and Qin reinforced and connected, and had new sections built, forming an effective defense barrier against the nomads in the north. It took 7 years to complete the wall, which then stretched 5,000 kilometers from Lin Tao in the west to present-day eastern Liaoning. Historical records indicate that about 400,000 soldiers and 500,000 civilians, including prisoners, poverty-stricken people and women, worked on the project. The population of Qin was only about 20 million, meaning that about 1/20th of the population was involved. The Qin dynasty used lots of its available manpower and material resources for the project. The completed wall was guarded by 200,000 soldiers. Some were recruited locally, and some from the Central Plain. The soldiers were required to maintain the wall, as well as guard the border. The soldiers guarding and maintaining the wall were also required to grow their own food. This system of soldier farmers was officially implemented in 178 BC in prefectures next to the northern border. This practice solved the problem of supplying food to the troops. One soldier could grow enough food to support 2 or even 3 soldiers. Some soldiers stayed on the wall for many years, and some never returned to their hometowns. Many soldiers married and had children near the Great Wall to ease their loneliness. The new families brought fresh life to the Great Wall. Qin Shi Huang used all the resources at his disposal to build the Great Wall. He tried to protect his kingdom from outside forces by building a wall around it, just as the rulers of the 6 states he annexed did. But the heavy tax burden stirred up great resentment among the people. This pass is known as the first pass under heaven. On a small hill near the town of Shanhai Guan is a temple in honor of Meng Jianyu. The temple is 1,500 years old. Instead of honoring Sakya Muni, or the Jade Emperor, it is dedicated to an ordinary woman named Meng Jianyu. People tied red silk ribbons on the ancient trees around the temple to show their respect. According to legend, her husband was recruited to work on the Great Wall, after which she didn't hear from him. She came from her faraway home with a winter coat she made for him. But when she arrived, she learned that her husband had died some time ago. She wept bitterly, and her tears formed a flood that broke the wall. The wall was built to stop nomads on horseback, but it was unable to withstand the tears of a woman. Of course, this is only a story, but the point is that no wall can be effective without the support of the people. In a peasant uprising 7 years after Qin Shi Huang's death, rebels overtook the capital of Shanyang, bringing down the Qin dynasty under Qin Shi Huang's son. The Qin dynasty fell, but the Great Wall remained, though damaged in places. It witnessed the downfall of the Qin and the rise of the Han. Many tourists think the Great Wall at Badaling is what the Great Wall looks like everywhere. In fact, the form of the Great Wall differs from one section to another. The Han Wall was unlike the Qin Wall, as well as unlike the later Ming Wall. In addition to sections of a solid wall, the Han Dynasty Wall also consisted of a line of signal beacons in some sections. This makes the Han Dynasty Wall unique. In the early Han Dynasty, Xiongnu from the north frequently took advantage of the chaos on the Central Plain to make cross-border raids as much as 400 kilometers inside the wall. Over a 70-year period, the Han Dynasty gradually recovered. The ingenious emperor Wudang of the Han Dynasty began actively resisting the invaders and started building a huge defense system from Gansu province to Lop Nor in Xinjiang. These are the remains of the Han Dynasty Wall. The line of beacons, plus the total length of solid wall built during successive dynasties, is more than 10,000 kilometers. It stretched from Lop Nor in the west to the Yalu River in the east. It covered more territory and was longer than any other defensive wall in history. At the height of the Han Dynasty, the nearly unbroken wall ran through Gansu, Inner Mongolia, Hebei, and Liaoning. Archaeologists found kindling among the Han signal beacons at Yumen Pass in Gansu. This easily ignited firewood was stored in piles. It was still in good condition after 2,000 years, thanks to the arid conditions in the Gobi Desert. Han Dynasty soldiers kept kindling at hand so they could quickly put some in a basket on the end of a long pole and set it on fire to call for reinforcements from the other states. In addition to the ancient kindling, the Dunhuang County Museum also has a relic called an igniter on display. The igniter was a prepared bundle of dried grass, which the soldiers used to ignite the kindling in the basket. This huge igniter was used to light kindling piled up on a high place. Workers used the only materials readily available in the Gobi Desert to build the Great Wall, such as sand, soil, and gravel. Local plants, such as reeds, willows, and poplars, were also used as building material. The Han Dynasty expanded westward as it grew stronger. Protected by the Great Wall, trade between the Central Plain and the Western region and countries in Central and West Asia flourished. The resulting trade routes became the famous Silk Road. Traders coming from the west brought jade, spices, and perfume to the Central Plain, along with new religions and music. Silk, gunpowder, and compasses from the Central Plain traveled the Silk Road to the west. The Great Wall, in addition to being a defense installation, also made exchange between the Central Plains and regions to the west possible. After battling for years, the formidable Xiongnu fighters finally faced the fact that they could never defeat the Han Dynasty. They sent an envoy to the Han Emperor asking for the hand of a Han princess. In 36 BC, the young and beautiful Wang Jiaojun set out on a journey to make peace with Xiongnu by marrying their leader. The tribal leader lovingly called her someone who hopefully brings peace in his native language. The marriage of Wang Zhaojun successfully maintained peace between Xiongnu and the Han Dynasty for 60 years. A tender young girl successfully used her beauty, kind-heartedness, and wisdom to keep the peace between the people on both sides of the Great Wall for over half a century. This is Wang Zhaojun's tomb, known as the Evergreen Tomb. The tomb was so named because there is always vegetation growing over it. Later, generations continued to tell the moving story of Wang Zhaojun. Strength of this dynasty was its formidable defense structure guarding against hostile forces. During times of peace, little construction on the walls took place, only because the wall was not so essential. This confidence showed the strength of a superpower. The Great Wall was begun in war, but was finished in peace. The wall, no longer needed for military purposes, has become a cultural symbol of peace. The story of the wall is old, but far from over.